Misha because, of course, his exhibition, Soft Bodies, Hard Spaces, is on at the gallery now, and unfortunately people cannot see it. So we thought, what better opportunity to begin than to talk to Misha about that show. So Misha, maybe you could begin just by saying hi and letting folks know where you are right now.
Hi. We drove back to Minnesota when things started feeling like it was less friendly to go outside in Brooklyn. So now I'm in a sort of random Airbnb in the town I grew up in Duluth.
Right. Okay. Good to know that Airbnb is still getting some business.
Yeah.
So since you're back in your home state, Misha, I thought we could begin by actually talking a little bit about growing up there and just give a very quick sketch of how you got from being a kid in Duluth to going to RISD. And I thought we could start by talking about this early work, which is called Pig Bench, because to me this seems like it maybe says something about where you're from and that part of the country.
Yeah, well, I think Minnesota and Duluth have been sort of a perennial reference point to me, in part because it's not, there's a lot of little like aesthetic things that I never, when you grow up in a place, obviously you don't see them as sort of exotic, but then when you pull them out of context, they sort of are. And a pig bench is a fairly common piece of furniture here. It's just a log with one horizontal cut, and usually sort of fortuitous branches are used as the legs, and then maybe one leg will be added. Mm. And I liked it because essentially it's probably like the most truly minimalist piece of furniture, since it's like the fewest cuts you could possibly make to make a seat. And in this piece, I just wanted to re-envision it with these trees that were made out of really colorful trash to make the rings. And the kind of idea of like making your own tree and like what grows in the Anthropocene, I suppose.
Yeah, like a second nature that's our replacement of nature, perhaps.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How does it actually stay together? Because you said it's made of trash, so how does it stay rigid?
Well, it's resin. So each layer of, I would put on one layer of trash and then sort of brush it with resin, and then just to do that again and again and again.
You know, one thing I really like about the design in all its simplicity, and it is a kind of fascinating way to start the conversation because it does have this kind of first thought quality, this design. It's so direct, but it's like you were referring to this vernacular tradition of ad hoc bricolage, you know, working with whatever lays to hand, but retranslating that into something that made sense for you in the 21st century. Was this something you already made at RISD? Were you already at design school when you made this?
No, this was I think the first piece I made after school.
Okay.
So yeah, I just sort of moved back to the city, and actually a friend was at a residency and I was just hanging out there and made it down at Wheaton Arts, but before I was a resident. And yeah, I don't know, I think it was kind of like an early sort of response to figuring out what making furniture felt like after school, and doing things with a different set of resources, like not having the sort of full material shops.
And I guess this is about 10 years ago, is that right, Misha? What year are we in?
Yeah, 10 years.
Something like that, yeah. So one other reason that I thought it would be interesting to start with this slide, if you can go to the next one, Lucy, is that we actually met through an exhibition that was called NYC Makers that was done at the Museum of Arts and Design when I was the director there. And I think this was in 2014. And you were a kind of breakout star of that show, I will say. Here we see one shot from the installation that shows a lot of your pieces gathered around the elevator doors. We also did have a piece from the Pig Bench series in the lobby. So it was one of the first things that people saw. And I gather it was also through this exhibition that you came into contact with Mark Benda and joined Friedman Benda Gallery. So a lot of things came out of this project. Can you just say a little bit about that series that people are looking at that's on the wall, these things that look like inflatables but aren't?
That was, I also made those at Wheaton. I got a residency there the next year, and it's a glass blowing program. And not being a glass blower, I, in addition to messing around with the material, I feel like I was thinking about how blowing glass was similar to blowing plastic, or like could be used for plastic. And so it kind of started this series of sewing bags, which was something I was really very comfortable on a sewing machine. And then rotocasting them with resin, so they would be these sort of inflated things. And also, being where this was, it's kind of in a rural town in New Jersey, and it was very strip mall-y, and just sorts of like looking at all the things that are sold at strip malls and like those aesthetics, I think really started creeping in. Just kind of that like feeling of like senseless bric-a-brac, but very colorful, and so I kind of wanted to render them in this balloony language, but they're also sort of like half like deflated. Yeah.
And one thing that I suppose this series has in common with the Pig Bench is that it's also looking back at decorative art history in a funny way, like Americana. So we see there that yellow and blue piece on the upper right hand corner looks sort of like a Federal era eagle top mirror. There's a kind of tall case clock situation there. There's another mirror down in the right hand side that seems like something from a Victorian parlor. And yet you also have a standing fan there on the lower left, that taller black piece. So there's this combination of the old and new. And I feel like one of the things that has always struck me about your work, Misha, and puts me in mind of a phrase that was used for the MoMA painting exhibition a couple of years ago that was called Forever Now, is this idea of everything being simultaneous. So there's a sense that everything is fair game, that it's kind of all one vast repertoire, past and present, kind of anything you find on the internet, anything you find in the strip mall, and everything gets kind of put into the mill, creatively speaking. And I wonder if that's something that you identify with, that idea of a kind of simultaneity or a universal sourcing. Is that part of your practice?
Yeah, definitely. I think now I feel like I see that in a much more like realistic and open way. I feel like with these pieces in the individual one, there still is kind of like some focused references. And now I feel like I see this sort of like expansive art history and materials as like a true old country buffet free for all, where you should just make like a huge mess on the plate. And the idea of like referencing a single thing in one piece now to me seems really, unexciting and banal. So
I see. So it's like each, maybe in fact, Lucy, we could go to the next slide here, because I feel like this show Midden Heap at Friedman Bend is where you really started to achieve that kind of fullness and richness. So what you're saying is that instead of having one piece that, even if it's made in this highly creative, unusual way of, sewing the plastic sleeve together and then sort of lo-fi rotocasting it with the resin, that's obviously very innovative, but you started to feel like each piece needed to have a kind of internal complexity and multiplicity to it. And I feel like this show Midden Heap is a really key moment where that started to come together for you. And I was wondering if you would talk a little bit about the concept for the show and the title of it as in relation to that theme.
well, I mean, obviously I think to a certain degree, like you have to make the concept and title feel like understandable in a straightforward way. So the idea that I was using trash and kind of collecting little treasures, which is what a midden heap is for an octopus, seemed like a good jumping off point. But I also think a lot of it for me was like in the collection and using of these little pieces, it was a lot of deciding what a piece looks like while making it, which seems really obvious, but actually like coming from sort of furniture making perspective isn't really the way that things are done. So just sort of building things in a more fluid way where like parts can kind of come together more organically was I think a big part of that show.
So a lot of it is about improvisation.
What was that, Glenn?
I said a lot of it was about improvisation. Getting some feedback there for some reason. Okay. Thanks everyone in the audience for bearing with us through these little technical hurdles as we do our first conversation here. But I was just asking you about the studio practice itself, Misha, the improvisatory quality of what you're doing. So, for example, are you working from drawings? Do you have a set idea of what you're going to make before you sit down? And how does that process work for you?
Well, with this show, sometimes yes, or there might be like a sketch for some aspects of the framework or some components, but there was a lot of parts that were really improvised while it was happening. Especially like all the weaving was very like there was part aspects that I was hands on with, but then lots of parts that were free for all, and um, that hasn't that's been the case till now that I do some pieces that way where it's really like open ended. But obviously, in the current show, there's some pieces that were pretty rigorously planned out. So it's not a rule, but it's an option at the buffet.
Right. I like this kind of strip mall buffet metaphor, but there's also an important leap in this Midden Heap show in that you started to broaden your repertoire beyond an American frame of reference. And I'm thinking particularly here of the work that you were doing in South Africa. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. At first, it started just with at a bronze foundry, and then the Southern Guild sort of helped set up this craft tour, and so I got to kind of go on this grand craft tour of Swaziland, and meet with a bunch of different producers there. So there's the weaving, and that was when I also met Mags, who did the tapestries. And I think the sensibility of making things there is so different. It's really readily intuitive. Like everyone sort of is a maker and is a creative. So in terms of coming up with ways to put things together, it was really fluid and doing things in a more just kind of ad hoc, natural way. Whereas I feel like working with people in the States, you kind of have to show up with a rigid plan, and they want to be really confident that the thing they end up producing looks exactly like the thing in the drawing. So it was a good place to kind of dive deeper into like making things in a more fluid way.
So there was a lack of literalness in the way that they would execute in the conversation with you. But can I ask you maybe a little bit of a tougher question, Misha, about the ethics of working in a geography where you don't have any personal history? Because there is, of course, a long line of designers dropping down in South Africa and elsewhere and sort of, for lack of a better word, appropriating the local repertoire. So how did you think about that, and how did you did you have sort of things that you were willing to do, things you didn't think would be right to do in that context?
Yes and no. I think that the issue that I've run into seeing other people's work and feeling like the reason I give myself a hall pass on it or feel like I'm doing it in a different way is largely because I feel like in my work in the studio, but also elsewhere, I leave all of these sort of open ends for other people's creativity. So I feel like in that process, it's kind of accepting and enthusiastic of what everyone else has to put into something. Um, and so I view myself more as creating an environment that's like inclusive of all of these different textures and methods and ideas, and just sort of like controlling them enough that they work together. And so I feel like with that, there's all these moments in each of these pieces where I I felt like I was kind of creating objects that worked with their cultural sensibility and skills, rather than coming in and kind of just dropping a PDF of what I wanted made. So I do think people have a lot of. I also have spent a lot of time producing things in other countries, and I see production overseas is a complex thing, not as a emphatically bad thing.
Mm.
So that's just sort of my perspective on it, is not that we shouldn't be making things in other places.
And I guess what you're saying is also that you're approaching your studio practice here in New York in a comparable way. So you have a lot of people working there with you now, and you're also trying to, in a way, orchestrate a group creative enterprise there.
Yeah, and I think in the studio, it's in a way it's similar. Each person, for the most part, will kind of take a project from the beginning to the end. I give projects to people who I think will put the right kind of creativity into them, and then I'm kind of overseeing it. So there's a lot of like leeway in a way, and I feel like that kind of creative spirit is cohesive through outsourcing also.
Right. Well, let's maybe now turn to the current show because it very much shows the output of that studio in its last year of operation. And we have a walkthrough video first that Lucy is going to show us. And maybe while we're looking at this, Misha, you could talk a little bit about the title of the show, which is Soft Bodies, Hard Spaces.
Yeah, I feel like this title of the show, I've been going on a lot of house tours over the past couple of years. I feel like it's been my foray into an interest in architecture. And architecture's obviously had such a big influence on design over the years, like thinking about how architects have designed furniture. And so much of it has to do with structure and these sort of boxy vertical spaces that to me are really disjointed from the human form, and just also like how we are as people. So I feel like this show is kind of my response, which was making objects that felt humany and organy and just sort of soft and relaxed. And with that, I didn't totally want to obliterate the sort of squareness of the gallery because it seemed like a nice foil for it. But in the opening, having the walls be soft, so like these square walls had sort of started to become a soft surface, seemed like a nice way to enter the show.
It might be worth telling the story of those walls, Misha, because there's a nice anecdote that goes with it.
I'm not sure which one that is, but
I'm thinking about the yarn sourcing.
oh well, to try and find all of this yarn, I had gotten on eBay looking for wholesale yarn and noticed that there was some in Minnesota. And also, she wouldn't send you by color. It was just like 100 pounds of whatever she felt like. And so I was very intrigued. So I wrote her several messages until I could figure out where she was, and then got a hold of her and ended up driving there. And it was just sort of a yarn hoarder who had mini semi trucks parked on her neighbor's farm filled with yarn. And she'd just gone around the country collecting yarn while stores were closing. So it was a very fun shopping expedition.
I also love the idea that it's local Minnesota sourcing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just that it's like me and my mom's like helping me like shovel yarn out of these semi trucks.
Yeah, it's like a DIY raised to a sort of asymptotic, exaggerated version of itself. What about the back end of the gallery that we're looking at now has a different wall surface? Can you just tell people about that?
The back room, I feel like in video and photo it doesn't play so well, but it's Elmer's glue and then sand, and then airbrushing over it on top of cardboard. So it kind of looks like a wallpaper from far away, but then up close it has this really pretty sort of Mars arid texture. And I thought it would be nice to have a ground for these things that was kind of dirty and harsh, as a sort of to split the difference with these really soft and friendly fuzzy surfaces in the front.
Yeah. So maybe we could talk a little bit about this idea of the soft and the hard in juxtaposition to one another. And there's lots of ways to think about that. I suppose one would be design historically. You might think of the hard surface as the emblematic surface of modernism. and international style architecture. And I feel like one of the things that you're getting at here perhaps is a kind of renewed approach to organic design, which was a term that was thrown around in the 1950s a lot. But also that you had this, I remember you said to me that you felt like you had a kind of architectural or design version of body dysmorphia, in the sense that these hard rectilinear surfaces and these industrial materials that we're surrounded by don't seem to, I suppose, fit us very well and don't seem very aligned to us as humans. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, maybe specifically in terms of how you see yourself coming along in response to a much longer trajectory about modernism. And Lucy, if you wanted to start flicking through the images from the show, you can start doing that now too while we talk.
Yeah, I think some of that idea was just that we build using these really regular forms and sort of regular rules. And so we get so used to things being a certain formula that it opens up us feeling bad about our spaces. And I just feel like if we would have constructed an entire material world where every object was singular, and people's spaces were all individual, we wouldn't have any of that. Like there wouldn't be this sense of like keeping up with the Joneses, or just this sort of ubiquitous aesthetics that kind of emerge in architecture and design.
Mhm.
So, and a lot of that I think is just encouraging, wanting objects that would encourage people to feel more themselves rather than like this idea of taste or like heading towards something where like everyone's just sort of trying to achieve, like get the same object or get like a certain level of like luxury.
Is that one reason
And
why you're, sorry to interrupt, but is that one reason why there seem to be so many different aesthetics in your work at the same time? I mean, I felt like this show was a little bit tighter in terms of its aesthetic range than Midden Heap, which was really very, very polymorphous and variable. But I wonder whether you feel like the fact that the objects look like they might have even been designed by different people, or certainly one person in very different moods, that it's part of the intent, that kind of emphasis on individualization.
yeah, I think some of that is just me sort of following an impulse, which is obviously against the grain. You know, I think we're so used to seeing shows where like the objects come from such a similar visual place,
Mm-hmm.
and it just doesn't feel true to me, because I, especially like living right now where you're just sort of inundated with like references from all over and all these different things. And I realized that part of the job of the artist is to kind of like make them cohesive enough that it's palatable together. But within that like outer circle of palatability, I want to be like at the very fringe, um, rather than making objects that feel totally cohesive, because I don't I don't feel cohesive. Like I guess, you know, like I just think the range of human moods and sort of interests is should be really broad. So it feels weird to me to try and like hone in on something precise, thinking that then the only purpose of honing in on it would be to like get rid of it again.
So that's also very interesting in relation to modernism as a coherent design strategy. So embracing that kind of purposeful incoherence seems like a sort of very contemporary way of thinking about the design object. Can I just ask you, in relation to that, one thing that people often say about your work, and I've said it myself, is that you seem like the exemplary millennial designer, so a kind of voice of your generation. Lucy, by the way, you can go ahead and go through those images again, just so people get another look at them.
Or a voice of a generation.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, because uh, I think it's perhaps easy to brand you that way, and I wonder how you feel about the sense of, well, people saying that you have a sensibility that's evocative of your cohort, the people that came up alongside you.
What do you mean? I feel fine with that. I mean, I feel like I've always sort of, I feel like the objects that resonate with me now are ones that feel like they were always just trying to capture like a single moment. and not the sensibility of trying to make something sort of timeless. So it's always just felt really important to me to make things that just felt like exactly of the time. So, which I don't even feel like I'm that a part of. It always feels like I'm still a spectator of that, but I still think it's like interesting. So maybe that's where that comes from.
Yeah. So you don't think you're not necessarily setting out to do something that speaks to our time. It's more that you're trying to be open, like an antenna, kind of channeling the signals of the moment and letting it all spill into the work. Is that fair?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I've described it to you before as being like wanting to be an emotional ethnographer of time.
Yeah.
Like you're just sort of trying to like capture the feeling of a time in an object because I think objects are sort of the best way to do that. They feel like they're little capsules to hold emotion in.
Yeah. Hey, Lucy, can you just hold it on this image? That's perfect. Because, yeah, great. Because another thing I wanted to ask you about, Misha, in relation to this is technology.
Mhm.
And one thing that you've been doing recently, which is, I think, new to your work just in the last couple of years, is using VR, virtual reality, as a sculpting medium, which is interesting in so many ways. One of which is that you had been talking about this kind of individualization as a big part of your work. And of course, to get to an environment, historically, to get to an environment that was entirely individual, everything unique, you'd have to go to the point before industrialization, when everything was artisanally made by craftspeople. And there's certainly some people who think that the advent of these mass customization and new design and fabrication techniques is maybe opening up another period where things can be more individuated because the efficiency of mass production is no longer necessary. We have these new technologies for making things. But leaving that aside, maybe you could talk a little bit about VR as a sculpting tool and what it's done for you. And I think this is what we're looking at now as an example of how you're applying it, correct?
This one, well, I'm actually excited that you stopped on this one because it's not. This one was
Okay.
entirely carved in foam and plaster
Mhm.
um, at full scale, and then those models were silicone molded, waxes were poured, ceramic shell, bronze casting, um, and so this one's done the total classic approach. Um, but obviously, in the molding, the carving and the molding process, you have to kind of make multiples, otherwise it just doesn't make any sense. Like it would just be so um, undoable.
Like
So
economically prohibitive, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah.
and so this one there'll be an addition of 8. And I like the fun part about working that way is you see the physical thing in front of you and you're tweaking it with your hands. And but what's interesting is like every tool wants to do something. So like the foam carving tools and the sanding produces a certain look. And when I started carving in VR, it really produces a similar look. Like it's meant for kids and it's kind of feels like this very squishy landscape that you're working in. But it comes with the really friendly aspect of like you don't need to make anything stand up. So
Mm.
while you're working on it, there's no gravity. Um, you can keep duplicating the thing and trying new things. So it just feels really fluid. Whereas when you're working on it in foam, by the time you're done, this one was also initially carved in foam. Um, months have gone into it. So it's not as easy to just like take the whole thing and smush it and like try something different.
So the VR is really a form generating phase, and then you actually do go through a lot of hand production phases to realize the work.
Um, No, so there's this piece, not exactly. This piece was kind of in limbo because we'd initially planned to cast it from molding it in foam, but because it was kind of prohibitively expensive, we ended up casting it from the 3D scan. So this was kind of the leeway into VR, was seeing that we could get a really good result from a digital model.
Mhm.
And then there's 2 pieces in the show where it totally switches, where there was never a physical model. It just went directly from the digital file into metal.
So is the big console is an example of that, is it not?
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe you could show that one, Lucy. Oh, there it is.
this one is also.
And this one, yeah.
This one, I mean, part of it is just like the ability with this technology to just lie in bed and like keep drawing things.
Mm.
And it is funny that you mentioned this sort of like pre-industrial period, because I feel like weirdly it is kind of a return to that, in that this sort of lavish ornament,
Mm.
even though I really don't see this as ornament, but this sort of like lavish texture that you can apply to things, and the sort of intricacy of how the parts are going to meet becomes really possible. So there is some elements of that where it gets a bit baroque and like the level that you can take it to.
Right, for sure. So it looks like a maybe early 17th century piece of court furniture from France or Italy, something like that.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's funny, we started with the pig bench and we were talking about the way that there's a kind of second nature or replacement of nature that you're providing in that much simpler piece. But here there's something, I think, analogous that's going on, because you could relate it to the Baroque period. You could certainly relate it to Surrealism. I think of Giacometti, for example, as a possible point of reference. Um, but also, it looks like internal organs. It looks like bones. It looks like fish skeletons, plant life, amoebas, bacteria. So it has this very strong naturalism to it as well, which feels like it anchors into that kind of core concept for the show.
Yeah, I think those are all true. I like that Michael Lewis chimes in Tange,
Yeah,
which is very true.
Kangi also. Thank you, Michael.
Um, I kind of feel like there's sort of like Jean art sculptures in a blender, where they're just like you threw in like a few extra ones and then kind of like hit liquefy. Um, I also wanted to sort of, in these, I feel like there is a lot of these really soft surrealist forms, and then it was really important that at some point there was a really man-made form that
Mm-hmm.
acted like the helper.
Mm.
Um, so here there's kind of that scoliosis spine that has this bridge structure, as though it like needs some kind of man-made support.
Yeah.
And I also felt like it's funny being in Minnesota and it's spring, and when I was doing this I hadn't thought about it, but growing up we would put taps in the trees for maple syrup, and it really looks like that also. This kind of like going out into the woods and putting little pegs all over the tree to lead it.
But there is a sense that there's an armature, an infrastructure that you're providing for all these soft biological forms.
Yeah, like as though they needed our help.
Right, right. Um, the other thing that strikes me about these shapes is that they have a very elastic relationship to scale. Like I mentioned that they could remind you of bacteria or amoeboid entities, tiny microscopic organisms, but they also might remind you of trees, or they might remind you of human bodies. So there's a sense that they telescope in terms of their natural scale, or they maybe have no natural scale. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, specifically with relation to VR, because I guess VR has no natural scale either. Like you're making pure forms, as you say. Gesundheit, Misha.
A volatile time for sneezing. Um,
So you're making these forms in a, as you say, a gravity-less space, and so also there's no like one-to-one there. There's no real scale.
yeah, that's true. I mean, when I'm doing it, I'm thinking of a certain scale, but it is interesting then having a digital, because we're able to print it off as a little tiny miniature, and then we can scale it to any size. So
Mm,
scale does start seeming really arbitrary.
mm,
Um, this piece, for instance, is part of, I just keep making things that are basically the size, like the same size as me.
mm,
Um, and I've started seeing them more as kind of like replacements for a figure. Like they sort of occupy the size of a human,
mm,
and I think that's a nice role for furniture, to feel like it's more or less a character.
mm. I like the idea of the show as a kind of extended act of self-portraiture, but as you were saying earlier, it's like the self is an incoherent self that has all of these aspects that somehow add up, but it's very difficult to map that. psychologically or formally.
Yeah.
Can you talk about this piece, Misha? Because it's a good example of how you mix materials. We were just looking at a piece that's in
I
bronze.
think the one right before it is better.
Great.
These two, there's a few pieces in the show that are really collagey, and I like working with a lot of different materials, and it seemed nice to put them all together. And I just think I feel like a lot of what happened with design, especially while I was studying it and sort of Dutch design, had to do with these really like cohesive singular use of a material and then just making a like slightly eccentric silhouette with it. And also a lot of references, like a lot of like vague historical references thrown in. And it was just nice sort of as like a therapeutic exercise to purge all of that, and to try and incorporate as many different materials and have them work together really empathetically, but not like they're not melded together. Like they still have their own kind of energy individually. Yeah, so
Yeah.
I'm just sort of
Sorry, go ahead.
no, I don't know.
Well, I was going to also say that the title seems to support that project, because what it makes me think about is like you look at something, whether it's on a dating app or on a social media page or whatever, and if you don't like it, you slide right or left.
Oh, I feel like, yeah, that does make sense, but this in tandem with the other one, I was really picturing them as like, they're like about to do like a group dance number.
Dance.
So I just felt like both of them kind of look like this, like they put on like a really like jaunty, fun look, and they're like doing like a line dance, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that's totally I totally see that they're like tangoing, but there's also maybe a, I don't want to call it indifference, but that thing I talked about earlier, like the Google image version of history and influence, where everything is equivalent and equally accessible, or at least it seems that way sometimes. That I guess the flip side of that is a kind of casualness with respect to any one thing. So for me, like the slide right, slide left thing has to do with that sort of
Yeah,
stepping stone like relationship that you seem to have to form.
well, it's
Whereas
like
I trust,
concrete,
yeah,
glass, bronze, like
yeah,
yeah, a casual sort of flipping through of options.
casual relation to materials as well. Um, just before we get on to Q&A, I wanted to talk about the tapestry and then show a couple of other exhibitions that you have on at the moment. Thanks, Lucy. So here's this amazing tapestry, which is about how big, Misha, would you say?
It's 10 feet by 12 feet.
Okay.
So
So
a
can you,
little picture is hard to do it justice.
yeah, totally. Can you just talk about the process of making this? It's obviously a different kettle of fish than making the 3D works.
In a way, but this one was maybe one of the sort of first 3D works for the show, because I did in VR I was sort of pretending to weave, so I was creating this kind of like 3D weaving sample in virtual reality, and then we took that and then rendered it, sort of trying to give each of those forms like as much of a yarn appearance as possible. And Mag Stevens, who works in Johannesburg, they hand spin and dye mohair, and then they put each stitch in one at a time on these big vertical looms. So they translated it into the 2D sort of image. And I really like this method of like taking something handmade, working on it in a virtual way, and then having it be handmade again. Like the kind of fluidness between those things feels like it always gets to this other place that feels like just sort of exciting to me.
Yeah, I like the idea that it's woven and it depicts a weaving, but the weaving that it depicts is a totally intuitive, non-weaving weaving, like these different levels of textile as a reference or an actuality.
Well, and it seemed, I feel like how things are made is like so important to me, and then not like getting to make a tapestry like this. I feel sort of like so privileged when there's like so many people really interested. Like it feels like a rare thing, um, but it felt like it would be fun to like reference weaving, and but I had to kind of do it in my way. So it was like, how can I come up with something that's about weaving and yarns and textile that feels like it's part of my world rather than like a knowledge base that I don't really have.
Yeah. It's also, to me, it's as close to a painting as I've seen you make. And it makes me think particularly of the abstract painting of the 1960s, like Helen Frankenthaler, Joan Mitchell, obviously coming out of Pollock. And one thing that those artists, I think, all tended to do was leave the edges of the picture field unoccupied, which is what you've done as well. So you have this one big globular, incredibly complicated motif sort of floating in this void. But in this piece, it feels like that void is digital to me somehow. It's like evokes that sense of that you are in this dimensionless, frictionless non-space, and that this abstract set of forms is presenting it to itself to you, maybe in a kind of science fiction scenario.
Yeah. No, I mean, I've obviously like leaving a blank border around something is the most self-restraint I think I've ever shown. And I think my biggest regret with this piece was I realized afterwards that I kind of felt like it should have had a drop shadow. Like it should have had one more digital clue that you were in a void.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and so maybe if there's another one, I think it might have that.
Well, also the drop shadow is the ultimate 2019, 2020 reference. So just so people know it was made now, right?
Yeah, yeah.
um, can we just quickly flick forward to those last two pictures, Lucy, of the two other shows you have that people can't see right now? Unfortunately. So one of them is in Mexico City, and the other is a traveling show called Breathless. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Speechless. Oh, did I lose you?
Yeah, just temporarily. You're back now.
Okay, okay. Well, this is in Mexico City, at Masa, and I was just down there working on some stuff, and then met with the people who are putting it together, and so it was a very like last minute fun thing to get to be in on.
Mm,
And they've been doing this show since last year, sort of taking over a mansion and filling it with different types of objects.
mm. Cool. And then this piece, this much more ambitious installation was at Dallas. And this shows
Mm-hmm.
traveling, correct?
Well, it is a show about where people are allowed to touch everything, and in my case, immerse their faces into everything.
Mm,
Um, so I think it's going to be a difficult show to figure out how to do
yeah,
in the foreseeable future.
yeah.
Um, but the idea behind the show was kind of to make environments and uh, art installation that was really inclusive to like kind of everyone. So you're allowed to interact with them in kind of any way you could think of, and um, that it would just sort of come from a different place rather than the usual approach, I suppose.
Mm,
And so in my case, I wanted to make these big sort of breathing spider sack or mochi things, and they're on a subfloor, so there's a whole series of pumps that are inflating and deflating these bags. Um, and as you walk through the space, they're kind of breathing around you.
mm,
And I feel like working on the show at the museum and seeing pieces in storage and seeing these kinds of sculptures draped in fabric. I always think that they're kind of nicer when they're draped. Like they feel a little bit more relatable, like they just put on a muumuu rather than like severe sculpture. And so I like the idea of having this kind of stubborn sculpture inside of a really ethereal breathing garment. And yeah,
mm,
that was that show.
Hmm. And definitely engages with the history of soft architecture, which connects to everything we were talking about with the Friedman Benda show, the Soft Bodies, Hard Spaces show. So you can see the continuity of thinking there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm obviously a sucker for inflatable and large inflatable forms, and like using air as a building material, obviously.
Mhm. Yeah, and of course that goes back all the way to those resin pieces that we showed at MAD that looked inflatable, were actually totally rigid because
Yeah.
they were made. So there's also a gamesmanship about the soft and the hard trading places with one another.
Well, yeah, I think that they just seem like, it just seems logical that like everything doesn't need to be hard.
Right.
So it's kind of like coming up with more options.
Right. Okay, well, we are now at Q&A time, if that's okay, Misha. And
Yeah.
what I would love to do is actually give people the opportunity to ask questions. So if people want to, and Lucy, are you up for this? To try to get people asking your questions directly. So do we have Nicole Hollis here still?
Yes, hi, good
Hey,
morning.
Nicole, thanks for
Morning,
joining.
Hi.
Hi, Misha.
How are you?
Good, thank you. I hadn't prepared a question, but I love your show. It's too bad I can't see it in person.
Oh.
Someone else had posted a chat question, and I don't want to steal their thunder, but can you tell us a little bit about the naming of some of the pieces?
I know, I feel like I give them these like really elaborate names and there should be good reasons behind it, but I'm never like thinking of a title for the piece when I'm making it. So it's always the thing's done and has left the studio, and then someone from the gallery is heckling me for a title. And I just started wanting to give them these really poetic, kind of new agey titles to kind of keep everything feeling really tender.
Mm.
The rock pieces I feel like is the easiest series because each one that uses one of those minerals, I I just give it a title that relates to some of the properties of the rock. So like the powers that those rocks have. And those always end up being really wishy-washy and fun.
Mm. Hey, Lucy, can you throw up a couple of pictures of the rock pieces?
Yeah, or all the things I forgot, those pieces as well. Those are great.
Thanks. Well, those ones just feel like there's a million things floating around and you're like, where are my keys? Oh shit, I forgot my coffee. And it just feel like that chandelier felt like me leaving the house every morning, and just needing like a million little loose things and like not getting all of them.
Do you enjoy making lighting fixtures, or is this your? I know you haven't made too many light fixtures in the past.
Well, yeah, there was definitely a lot of lighting in this show, and I feel like lighting because some of them are throwing a lot of light, and some of them like have a single tiny LED bulb in it. And I like that lighting feels kind of like jewelry for the house. And I think because of that, people seem to buy really like sort of severe lighting, like things that feel like the equivalent of like a classic diamond ring. And I just kind of wanted to propose like another format, which is really zany lighting.
So Barbara Paris Gifford, my old friend from MAD. Barbara, are you still with us? Had also a question about titles, but specifically about the emotional quality of the pieces.
Hi, Glenn.
Hey, Barbara, how you doing?
I'm okay. How are you?
Good, good. Yeah, tell me more about what you'd like to hear from Misha.
Yeah, I mean, my question was more in line with what Nicole was saying. I was just, as we were going through the pieces, the names were flashing up, and it just seemed like we were talking more about the making components of the pieces, and it seemed like there was a lot of emotionality that we were kind of missing out on a bit, whether that was humor or, Misha's sort of state at the time. But I feel like we answered that a bit with the last round of conversation. So I don't know if you want to go more into that, but I feel better since Nicole asked.
Oh, yeah. Well, I feel like I view each of the objects as like these really complex things, and I'm super interested in how things are made, so it's usually like the first thing I want to talk about. But then I give them these titles that feel really like humanizing, maybe, even though I don't feel like I'm trying to humanize them. I'm like promoting object oncology, maybe. That yeah, that they would just feel like maybe the objects were sort of like funny or having their whole own world of emotions going on.
Awesome, thanks, Misha. So we also had a question from Colby. Colby Charpentier, are you still here, Colby?
Yep, still here.
Awesome. Hi, how you doing?
Hey. Yeah, so I kind of, I'll just kind of read what I have in the chat here, and then maybe pull it up. So one would anticipate, Misha, that your punchy use of color and material in your work and living space would stretch your personal sense of normal values. So as a follow-up to Glenn's question, in how you represent the times, where you responded that you see yourself more of like a conduit or kind of like an antenna. How do you manage your level of comfort with the work?
Oh, well, I guess like I don't know. I mean, I think humans are so adaptive. Like we just recalibrate to anything, and so I think with color and people always ask me like if I must get sick of our kitchen, and it actually just starts feeling so normal. You know, like a ton of color is the same thing as beige after a while. So it's just like I feel like with the objects, it's super important to me that if they're meant to function, that they do, and like if it's a couch, that it's insanely comfortable. So I'm certainly not trying to like deprive myself or others of sort of object pleasure, but I think the volume, like the kinds of colors and stuff, it just I'm not even really trying to be provocative. They're just it's like the amount of saturation that I like. Although I do think I'm getting better about, I feel like early on I felt a lot of pressure to make things that were really cartoony and would be like just bold for bold's sake. And I think in the last couple of shows I've dialed back on that and tried to be okay making some things that are more nuanced or with more muted tones. Although I still think like to most people they read as intense.
But certainly the palette of materials, the palette of color, and the palette of forms all have a kind of equivalent intensity.
Yeah, well, I do see them all as like volume buttons on a sort of board, and it's like, what are you doing if you're not pushing them all to the top? But I do think with color, I've definitely, like this piece that's on the screen now, it's rust tones and gold and wood and amber. Like it's not, I've sort of dialed back from having to like spray everything with the Saturday morning colors.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Saturday Morning because we haven't talked about like Nickelodeon in the 1990s yet, but that's another important reference, right? We'll just take 2 or 3 more questions. Can we go to Roseanne Summerson next?
Oh, Roseanne's here.
Hey, Roseanne, how you doing? Nice to have you with us. Oops.
For a long time, and it's so it's so intentional, and there's so much organization and complexity to your pieces, particularly now that you're collaborating with other fabricators and such a range of materials. And I'm curious, the work looks so much like it just sort of grew out of its own life force, but I'm curious, now that you're using virtual reality as a tool, a developmental tool, and where you're working with such complex coordination of parts. What is your sketching or modeling process? How has that evolved with work that looks like it just sort of came of itself?
Well, I think it depends on the piece, really. So I used to be very, like, I would make a cardboard and plaster and clay model of basically every piece. And it was like a, a miniature maquette in sort of plastic materials. And now it's super fluid between everything. So there'll be parts that I'll sketch on paper and then recreate the elements digitally. And then there'll be parts that I'll make little models in clay or other materials. And then sometimes things get put together digitally, or sometimes they just go straight from sketches into making. And with this show, especially, I'd moved studios about 6 months before making this show. So we were able to do so much more ourselves. So just having control, like the piece that's on the screen now, we fabricated entirely in the studio. And just being able to do the metal casting and ourselves, and I did the paint job that's kind of like a lavender sparkle. I think having that latitude to just sort of be super involved in all the processes is really helpful, because you can kind of bounce back and forth between the plan and the making.
My an ulterior motive question is wondering if the conceptual form that you use, whether it's sketching or clay or virtual reality, has anything to do with how you define hard and soft. If ultimately it ends up influencing what you categorize as hard and what you categorize as soft, if there's a relationship between the thinking material and the finished object.
I guess I don't even know if I know quite how to answer that, other than I feel like I sort of will see things in my head, and the process to get there feels like I just try and choose the path of least resistance. So not being too concerned with what the route is, whether it's what the mode of production or what the mode of kind of, obviously, like, there's a whole process of like getting the thing you're imagining into a state where you can show it to someone else as a drawing or a model. But trying to be more fluid with how it gets to there. But definitely with this show, I mean, I think most of the objects are sort of on the soft end, and then there was just a few elements that I saw as hard tossed in to kind of grate against them. So it was meant to feel like, most things were meant to feel as kind of like soft and liquid and ethereal as possible. There's definitely some like outliers though. We're going through the slideshow.
Well, congratulations. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Roseanne.
It's nice to see you, even on a tiny little screen.
I know.
For those that don't know, Roseanne is the head of RISD, where Misha went to school. So that's a great connection to make again. We'll just have maybe two last questions, first from John Clark and then Alanis McNear. John, you wanted to ask about easy and cheap versus real and expensive materials, which seems like a fascinating question.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
So I work with a small studio in Chicago here, Jordan Moser. We do a lot of organic cast furnitures, metals, plastics, glasses, and whatever, but we try to work with durable, quote, real materials as much as possible. And so I'm curious, when you make these pieces, whether you have some sort of internal revulsion to plastics that maybe some of us do, and whether you'd prefer to make everything out of bronze and aluminum and glass, or whether you don't really care, you're kind of agnostic material-wise.
No, I actually see it as like a permanent goal to feel nothing about any material. So I feel like I had this kind of eye-opening experience with, I was working on a jewelry project with Giancarlo Montebello, who's this incredible Italian jeweler who's produced all this art jewelry. And I was talking about saying, some cheaper material he could use, like the gold and the sort of precious stones. And he just started pulling out boxes and boxes of like just really different, funny, cheap plastic materials. And then we ended up wandering next door to his studio, and there was this kind of like Chinese dollar jewelry store that just had all this plastic jewelry in it. And we started buying things, and he was going to cut them up. And to me, it was like, isn't this funny, the friction between these things? And then it became obvious that to him there was just like no difference. Like you could use gold or you could use the plastic, and they could be mixed, and it wasn't even. I'd always seen it as creating friction between the sort of precious materials and the non-precious. And then I started realizing that if you saw past that, it was just that like the whole world of materials is open to you. Mm. And I think the best piece I've seen recently that exemplifies that was Nicole Eisenman's sculpture garden at the Whitney outside. Was like these huge bronze sculptures, but then they were wearing socks, and they had sort of ratchet straps from Home Depot and foam. And the bronze was super beautiful, but then the way that all the other materials were treated was equally thoughtful. And it was just so much better than anything I've seen for a long time. And I think it was because it reached that place of like feeling like transcending materials rather than like honoring them, which I think is, it sounds like blasé to cast them aside like that, but like bronze is only special because there's arbitrarily less of it. So
well, I guess the way we think about it is we make pieces for use, for restaurants, for hotels. And so if you were to make a plastic bar top over a couple of years, it would eventually start to wear and peel and flake and all that. And so there's certain embedded qualities of use in certain materials that might be different in an art space.
That's true. Yeah, and I think that can be interesting. But I think a lot of that is using materials. You know, if the space made the worn out plastic look cool, like if that felt like a interesting patina that the plastic had been like worn to shit, then that would be valuable. So I think a lot of it is just sort of building the context around the materials that you need rather than relying on the materials is my approach.
Yeah.
Great. And we have one last question from Alanis.
Hello, everybody.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi, thank you for having me. My question is about the VR program, which I've never personally used, so this question could come out of my ignorance from that. But so you said that there's no gravity, and it really allows you to kind of not have to worry about making things stand when you're doing that process. And for the pieces that don't get a physical model and just go straight into production, with some of your forms and the materials that you're choosing, there's a lot of weight in certain areas. Do you ever get concerned or run into a problem that when this piece is casted that it will be top heavy or won't stand? And is there any manipulation to the pieces after that process, like working back and forth between physically creating and virtually creating?
Well, I like that the pieces feel sort of like effortless. So but obviously in the computer, once after the VR one is done, we take it into another program and like make sure that the feet are flat and like the dimensions are the sizes we need. And we're also able to see with the casting like the wall thickness, so we're going to know how heavy the piece is and where the weight is. So it is possible to see a lot of parts before, like it's not totally flying blind, like you kind of have quite a bit of information. And there's other concerns like with the lighting ones, you know, where the hollow passageways are to make sure that the cords can get there, stuff like that. But then, yeah, afterward, once it's, you know, if it's bronze, then they can do quite a bit of work on it afterwards. So kind of adjusting the finishes and the forms. But so far, it's worked pretty well in terms of like the pieces sitting and having flat surfaces and all of those things.
Okay,
Great.
excellent.
Well, that unfortunately brings us to time. I'm just going to cite something that Michael Lewis said to me earlier, which is that he reminded me that Damien Hirst's show occurred just before the crash of 2008. We all remember that, and I think sold out. And he was saying, you know, how poignant it was to see the exhibition that's now at Friedman Bend as this incredible, exuberant, optimistic project. And now we're all obviously in this kind of suspended animation state right now. But maybe it gives us something to work back towards, that kind of hope for what design can do and the incredible creative drive and energy that can come out of someone like you, Misha. So thank you so much for joining us and being the first guinea pig guest on this.
Happy to do it.
Yeah, it's really awesome to have you. Next week, we're going to have Chris Shank from Detroit joining us. And the week after that, we're going to have Faye Too Good. So please, everyone who's been able to join us today, thank you for being here. And join us again next week for Design Dialogue. And yeah, I guess just help me thank Misha by clapping quietly in your own homes. and thanks for joining us. Misha, hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming. That was great.
Okay, so long.